Hello. This time, I will present the video I prepared on the topic of René Guénon's Traditionalism and the collapse of the modern world. This video presentation will be in a slightly different format. So, I will try to present my thoughts and explanations about the topic through a video slide that combines visual, schematic, and written text information. Now, let's move on to the slide. Let me note that such a format arises both out of necessity and is richer in content. That is, it can fully cover the topic. In this way, we address both the visual and auditory memory of the person. The necessity also comes from the fact that anything a person will speak about must have a counterpart in the intellectual circles of the language of the place where they are speaking. If the fundamental principles, terminology, and initial informative base of a topic do not exist in the language of the society or space, then we are talking about something without a counterpart. It's like speaking to a wall. Therefore, I hope that the informative backdrop will complement our conversation.
In general, the biography of René Guénon, the intellectual roots of traditionalism, the essence of the school of traditionalism and its opposition to the modern world will form part of our informative background.
I will also discuss the main critiques and refutations of this movement and try to add my own insights. I present this topic within the introduction video series of Kiphrology. So our previous video related to the crisis of reality was an introduction to theology. This naming is somewhat related to Palestinian Edward Said's work, Orientalism. We can call this the attempt to stand firmly on an intellectual platform against recognizing ourselves from a foreign perspective. We may call it guiding the chaotic flow of intellectual information in the modern era. Lastly, let me mention that when discussing the roots of traditionalism, the Advaita Vedanta teaching, that is the monistic non-dualism doctrine, will also be a very important point at the center of our discussion. The list of literature we can recommend in traditionalism is very long. Here, I have noted only certain works that I consider important. Regarding the topic we are discussing, two fundamental books are recommended, whose covers you can see on the screen in English. One is René Guénon's The Crisis of the Modern World. The other is Mark Sedgwick's Against the Modern World, Traditionalism and the Secret Intellectual History of the 20th Century. You can research additional sources on internet resources. This recommended bibliography list is also, in a certain sense, the list of literature that is used. By the way, let me mention that while conducting research or reading works on a certain topic, it is particularly beneficial to read with an analytical and critical perspective. Otherwise, reading the words written in any book with direct acceptance, without it being a book related to sensitive beliefs, can sometimes be harmful. Albeit I have sometimes read the written information you see on the screen, which serves as introductory information on the topic, I mainly leave it to your discretion. Throughout this video slide, you can read the written information you see, especially at this moment, in the green and white section by pausing the video. Nuhui Ilieva. For my part, I will try to explain the diagram depicted in the blue section. In general, let us remember that Guénon believed in the mystical transmission of ancient wisdom, initially clear to everyone, but over time, its original ancient connection was lost due to separation and distancing. The meaning of the word tradition from Latin is also transmission. The belief in the existence of such ancient wisdom is called perennialism. In this depicted scheme, we see that there are three main characteristics of traditionalism. The first characteristic is perennialism. The second characteristic is inversion. The third characteristic is initiation. About the first aspect, perennialism, we will explain it later in detail extensively. However, as initial information, let me note that at the beginning there is a state of such perfection, completeness, where the initial, eternal, unchanging ancient wisdom is clear to everyone. This period is called the Golden Age, during which everyone lives in unity and harmony with the initial ancient wisdoms, experiencing a state of perfection. The cyclical period, accompanied by separation over time, results in a departure from this state of perfection and the emergence of deficiencies and negativities. As a result, this wisdom that was accessible to everyone in ancient times is now concentrated in the hands of a special group called sacred, of chosen priests, mystics, gurus, that is, guides, who maintain a special connection with it and pass it on to subsequent generations. The remaining other people can only survive by connecting in special ways to these chosen individuals, considered supremely perfect humans who have maintained their connection with the primordial truth through guides. This means connecting to the tradition led by priests, mystics, gurus, in other words, specially chosen people, the sacred ones, who carry this ancient wisdom. Those who fall outside the tradition are considered profane because they are outside the initial sacred. The meaning of the word profane is attributed to a person who has fallen away from the sacred, as if they have lost their connection with the original sacred. From a traditionalist perspective, it can also be understood as ignorant. The second feature, inversion, most often appears in discussions about the Antichrist. If the Messiah represents wisdom, his opposite, the anti-Messiah or Antichrist, is the inversion of the Messiah, the Dajjal. Inversion is essentially the reversal of concepts. Something known to everyone as white is known as black. In René Guénon's understanding, the meaning of the universe is that in the modern era, when everything is in a state of moral decline and degradation, people think they are witnessing progress, development, and beauty. In short, the initial sign of perennialism, that is ancient wisdom, over time undergoes separation and inversion, and as a result, things known as ignorance start to be considered as knowledge. True wisdom is then viewed as ignorance, as reactionary. The third and final characteristic of traditionalism is initiation. Initiation means enlightenment. That is, a person, by connecting with a guide, similar to the disciple-master relationship in Sufism, maintains their connection with the initial ancient wisdom, and as a result, enlightenment occurs through special ways. This means that enlightenment through such guides, by connecting with guides, is actually about connecting to tradition. By following any traditional path, a person becomes connected to the primordial tradition. While talking about initiation, it's also necessary to provide information about counter-initiation. According to René Guénon, contra-initiation is initiation into false tradition, which in his view is theosophy. That is, theosophy is considered as pseudo-tradition. It is important to remember the three characteristics of traditionalism in this order. First, we speak of the existence of ancient wisdom. Then, as a result of separation, inversion occurs and everything is turned upside down. And here, we need a connection with the primordial wisdom. This need is fulfilled through initiation, that is, by attaching to traditions. People perform an act that opens the way to hidden ancient knowledge, leading back to the original tradition. In fact, as noted in the texts, although the initial ancient wisdom, the Perennial Philosophy, was introduced by Augustinus Daco in the 16th century, it was first expressed based on the ideas of the Renaissance thinker, priest Marsilio Ficino. In addition to being a Catholic priest, Ficino is the founder of the Platonic Academy in Florence. He actually considered the inclination towards Plato as divine grace in order to defend Christianity, because he placed Plato and Christianity on the same level. He did not distinguish the Catholicism he saw as the official religion from the initial natural religion. Ficino preferred to give philosophy a religious metaphysical color, rather than justifying religion with various philosophical shades or scholastic methods. According to many Renaissance philosophers like Ficino and Mirandola, God is the source of both Christian teaching and Platonic teaching. Eternal philosophy, that is, ancient wisdom, precedes both, meaning it unites both on a common ground. In this worldview, all religions originate from a single source, and at their foundation lies the initial natural religion, sometimes also called ancient theology. In this sense, they believe that many religions, such as ancient Egyptian religions, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity, originated from the same source, and were manifestations of natural religion in various forms. Marsilio Ficino was also the translator of the Hermetic corpus, thus the source of ancient wisdom texts on which Renaissance thinkers based themselves was Hermes Trismegistus's Corpus Hermeticum work, because it was considered an older text than those of Plato and Jesus. However, new doubts and facts about the antiquity of this text later diminished interest in perennialism. And once again, perennialism was revived in the 19th century in the form of Vedanta perennialism. This happened after India's colonization by Britain, leading to the translation and popularization of Hindu texts, the Vedas, in the West. René Guénon became acquainted with these texts through such indirect means. In this regard, René Guénon focused more on Vedanta perennialism rather than Hermetic perennialism. In general, when we talk about perennialism, we are actually talking about metaphysics. The word philosophy is insufficient to express metaphysics, and as a result, we call it the eternal philosophy. Initially, the word philosophy attributed to Pythagoras means love of wisdom, search for wisdom. That is, while philosophy in Pythagoreanism and Platonism was a seeking of wisdom, a love for wisdom, an orientation towards wisdom, later on, the discipline of philosophy itself replaces the position of wisdom. According to Guénon, this ultimately leads to the forgetting of wisdom. Thus, philosophy focuses on a situation that needs to be resolved beforehand in order to reach wisdom. Especially in the modern era, a humanist philosophy concept that rejects metaphysics has emerged. The concept that Guénon opposed was actually this: the rejection of metaphysics and the distancing from the esoteric actually led to the emergence of materialism and a focus on external things. This type of materialism is considered fundamental to modern profane society. To differentiate between traditional and modern worldviews, we must first distinguish between these two concepts of time. The traditional understanding of time was cyclical. This concept moves from initial perfection towards the negative and then completes an eternal return to the initial perfection. That is, this concept of time is absolute. It is repetitive, cyclical, periodic. In mythology, it is sometimes called Zruvan, or in our language, it is more commonly known by the term circular fate. In this regard, epochs begin with the departure from the initial ancient state of perfection, where there was no suffering, torment, or flaws, that is, from the Golden Age, and move cyclically. Ultimately, it concludes in the Iron Age, where flaws and evils reach their peak, and moral erosion occurs, returning to its original state. The modern concept of time, however, consists of a straight line with an abstract beginning and end. In the modern concept of time, the past is primitive, archaic, and mythical, while the future is current, progressive, rational, and reliable. This type of straight line actually develops from simple to complex. As we see from the comparison, if the traditional time concept idealizes the ancient, the modern time concept idealizes the future. In fact, we could compare the Abrahamic monotheistic concept of time here. However, to stay closer to our topic, we will suffice with this for now. It is possible to observe the traditional concept of time in many things. For example, the succession of the seasons is given as an example of this. Additionally, the same concept of time emerges under different names in many ancient traditions. In Hinduism, a day in Brahma's life is called a kalpa. Each kalpa is divided into several manvantaras, and each manvantara consists of 4 parts: Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. As you can see, it is divided here into Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. The period we are currently living in is the last Kali Yuga, which is the Iron Age. We can see this better in the other schematically expressed cycle. Kali Yuga is the last phase of degradation. That is, we transition from the most perfect world to a less perfect world, a degraded world, and a dead world. That is, the Kali Yuga stage, and the time we live in is considered the Kali Yuga time. In this stage, the virtue of the initial period is replaced by evil, and truth is replaced by falsehood. That is, everything divine takes on a demonic appearance. Mark Sedgwick divides the history of traditionalism into 3 phases. In the first phase, René Guénon developed traditionalism philosophy until the year 1930. He wrote various books and articles and gathered supporters around him. In the second phase, attempts to apply traditionalism in practice occur. As an example of this in the East, we can cite the rise of Sufism. In the West, in Europe, the emergence of fascism, exemplified by Russia, can be cited. Particularly, we can reference the line of Julius Evola as an example. Specifically, we can currently see the political and social manifestation of the metaphysical worldview of Sufi Batinism in Iran's clerical regime. In this example, we can see that the rhetoric there is closer to the metaphysical traditional line than the Abrahamic monotheistic prophetic tradition, and closer to the priesthood tradition, because we can see the political expression of a system where spirituality is foremost. In the West, in Europe, we can observe the resurgence of traditional rhetoric against the backdrop of the rise of the right. In the third phase, we can particularly note the absorption of the traditional worldview into Western culture and its spread again towards the East. René Guénon's life can be divided into 3 stages: occultism, Catholicism, and Sufism. In 1906, René Guénon meets Gérard Encausse, known as Papoose, and joins the Martinist occult order. However, after some time, he is expelled from there. It should be noted that Guénon comes from an upper bourgeois Catholic family and actually wanted to revive Catholicism in the modern era by combining it with Freemasonry to restore its former glory. However, later he saw that dry ritualism had replaced spirituality in the West, leading him to turn to Sufi Islam. From this perspective, Guénon actually had sympathy for the circle of Ibn Arabi. René Guénon's follower and another traditionalist thinker, Sean, said that Guénon choosing the path of Sufi Islam was actually because there was no other alternative, because he did not believe in the initiatory role of Christian Catholicism. He regarded Buddhism as heterodox. The caste system of Hinduism, however, was inaccessible for René Guénon. Guénon needed an initiative. Sufism provided him such an opportunity, such a possibility. Guénon spent the last years of his life in Egypt under the name Abd al-Wahid Yahya, and also acquired Egyptian citizenship. One of the versions is that Guénon living in Egypt was because he was afraid of the occultist counter-initiation influences coming from Europe. It was, in a way, an escape, a hiding. While reading Mark Sedgwick's book Against the Modern World, Traditionalism on the Secured Intellectual History of the 20th Century, I decided to read it with a Gestalt technique, that is, by analyzing it, and this scheme emerged. I follow the kind of trace we usually see in movies, that when detectives trace criminal connections, a similar kind of scheme emerges. However, this is not about criminal connections, but a scheme of intellectual thought connections. The book I referenced did not have such a scheme. I just, while reading the book, thought of recreating the relationship system there in a way that I understood it. And although it seems complicated at first glance, it's actually something simple. If we say that there is a mystical source that any intellectual thinker or philosopher is nurtured by, perhaps we would not be mistaken. All these intellectuals we see have fundamentally been nurtured by two main sources based on perennialism. These two sources are the Hermetic corpus and the Vedas. We talked a little earlier about the Hermetic corpus. Hermes Trismegistus is an ancient mythical figure. Sometimes this is also associated with the prophet Idris, or we can say a demigod figure who acts as a messenger between the gods and humans in ancient Greek mythology. In a way, he is an interpreter, meaning he interprets the thoughts of the gods to humans. In this regard, the concept of hermeneutics also emerged in European philosophy. As you can see in this scheme, Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola were influenced by the Hermetic corpus and also by Plato. At the same time, many philosophers like Alagnoris and Spinoza were also influenced. Later on, in the 19th century, we can note the Hermetic influence on Gerard Ancos and Henry Olcott. The Vedas became popular in the 19th century due to India being a colony and the translation of Hindu texts, the Vedas, thereafter. And then, being very ancient texts, they overshadow the Hermetic corpus. In this regard, the Vedanta perennialism emerged. Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, upon first encountering the translations of the Vedas, paved the way for the popularization of this perennialistic thought in the United States. This also later led to Colonel Olcott founding the Theosophical Society. Colonel Olcott is an interesting character. He is both a military man and a journalist, and also the founder of the Theosophical Society involved in this type of spiritualism. Henry Olcott first witnessed the phenomenon of mesmerism in 1844, which led him towards spiritualism. Mesmerism is magical magnetism that implies a telepathic influence. Later, Henry Olcott witnesses various paranormal and unusual events in the state of Vermont and documents them in his journalistic work. Helena Blavatsky, who becomes acquainted with these writings, meets with Olcott, and as a result, they get to know each other. Yelena Blavatskaya is actually a figure with a dark past and unusual interests. She came from the Russian region to the Balkans, and the fact that the Theosophical Society is known as charlatanism or a sect worldwide is partly associated with her name. In general, the recognition of the Vedas in the United States of America and worldwide through Thoreau and Emerson plays an important role in the development of the Theosophical Society and traditionalism. From that perspective, we can consider the famous intellectual Aldous Huxley, whom we know from the work Brave New World, as a representative of perennialism. Notably, he also has a book titled The Perennial Philosophy. I especially want to note the difference between the perennialistic thoughts that emerged in continental Europe and the United States of America. I want to express my personal observation that in America it has emerged and become popular more in the form of spiritualistic and theosophical society. However, in continental Europe, this has taken on a slightly completely different path, the traditionalist movement. In this regard, for example, René Guénon's view of theosophy as pseudo-traditionalism is also interesting. It's like this view emerging as theosophy appears as attempts to deviate from the true orthodox tradition. That is how it appears from René Guénon's perspective. Finally, let's talk a bit about Gérard Ancosse, also known as Papus. I should note that Gérard Ancosse was influenced by the Hermetic tradition and can be considered one of the first representatives of Vedanta perennialism. Ancosse, known as Papus, was a famous French Mason, noted for being at the level of the great unknowns, an occultist and a representative of the Martinist movement. He was also a member of the Kabbalistic Rosicrucian society. Let me note that he has more than 25 works related to Kabbalah and many esoteric subjects. After René Guénon was introduced to Freemasonry and occultist movements by Gérard Roncoset, Guénon did not remain there and was later expelled. We previously mentioned this. After a certain period, as you can see in the diagram here, Guénon turned towards Sufism through the Ibn Arabi line. In his book Crisis of the Modern World, Guénon repeatedly notes that haven't we reached that period mentioned by ancient Hindu seers where castes will mix, family will lose its significance, wars will increase, and spirituality will be lost. In this regard, we see René Guénon's. Based on the book titled Crisis of the Modern World, this traditionalist line, what is seen as a crisis or deviation is actually what should be. However, you should not be a part of this. In this regard, traditionalism is in a paradox. On one hand, it is against modernity, and on the other hand, it sees this modern era, which it views as corruption, as a part of its cyclical process. In this modern era, quality has diminished and quantity has increased. Human beings have been lost among insignificant details of quantity. Modernism hastens to declare everything outside of observation and experience not only unknown but impossible to know. This is something that the materialistic mindset of the modern era has produced. Guénon asks whether people are truly happy in this modern conformist era, where technology, welfare, and development are rising. The answer is no, because people do not feel satisfied amidst the fulfillment of their material needs and demands. On the contrary, their needs increase even more, and material provision creates more needs than it can satisfy. Guénon notes that in ancient times, people were not suffering from the lack of all these types of things. On the contrary, they were happier. Cunan's book Orient et Occident, East and West, emerged as a call for the salvation of the West through Eastern traditions. If traditional Western civilization had remained, there would be no need for the East-West confrontation. The emergence of such a confrontation image actually happened due to the deviation of the West. That is, modern thought emerged in the West. In this regard, this new modern thought has produced a profane society, and a separation from the sacred has occurred. The sacred is what is supreme and superhuman. The modern profane global society is what has diverged from the sacred. All these things we see as signs of modernity can actually be summarized in one sentence. The isms produced by a civilization model that emerges from the denial of everything superhuman, such as humanism, link all parameters of existence to humans, and reject anything superior, including all metaphysics. This closed perception limited to humans creates a situation where quantity dominates and quality is relegated to the background. All these isms we see on the screen are actually key characteristics of this modern era. As Samuel Murchie noted, we can say that a straitjacket made of these isms is woven for the people of the modern era. Secularism grants status to the formation of all social institutions by detaching them from spiritual origins and placing them within a system of worldly relations. The concept of individualism and democracy, however, has given rise to a form where quantification prevails and truth becomes devalued. Science, however, has broken away from a metaphysical foundation and, without adhering to any principle, is moving towards division into meaningless details consisting of factual analytical investigation of events. It is possible to analyze other isms within this framework as well. If we are talking about non-duality, I should note that the mindset of modern humans, founded by Plato and reaching its peak with Hegel over more than 2,000 years, created a certain paradigm. Actually, although the roots of this modern paradigm extend to Plato, Plato's doctrine was nothing but the systematization of ancient metaphysical wisdom in philosophical language. In this regard, the current materialistic modern world, dominated by things like utilitarianism, sensualism, liberalism, and positivism, is essentially a deconstruction of the ancient metaphysical traditionalist foundation. We know Plato's allegory of the cave. All the shadows we consider real in the cave are actually reflections, projections of the originals, the ideas above. If the crude things in the lower world, for example, a horse, are a projection or reflection of the ideas in the finer plane above, then all of this is based on the principle of analogy. Analogy ultimately points to the unity of above and below, meaning the unity of duality, identity. According to this view, it follows that the idea of ideas is existence. Existence is virtue. Pure higher existence is God, meaning we are discussing an identity principle extending up to God and consisting of a series of analogies. However, in the Abrahamic monotheistic prophetic tradition that turns from falsehood to truth, God can have no equal, meaning there can be no analogy. The illusion of duality actually relies on the principle of identity. This is an immanent concept limited by human perception. Let's generally remember that Guénon bases all his ideas on the problem of affirmation. Beyond absolute affirmation, nothing can exist except error. By exploring the essence of analogies between the material and spiritual, Guénon provides the fundamental keys of symbolism in his book on symbolism. The thesis of duality being the same within itself serves as the foundational basis of the Traditionalist School. It appears here that René Guénon expresses that metaphysics is immutable, surpassing any dogmas and philosophical systems, and cannot be limited by them. Meanwhile, philosophy is essentially an attempt to concretize abstract concepts and create a system. Moreover, in the post-Hegel and postmodern era, philosophy turns into an auxiliary tool that is concerned with the details of life and cannot even create a system. Here, we can observe that even though Leibniz was actually a philosopher, he hinted at the problem of affirmation as someone who has a certain connection with perennialism. That is, Leibniz notes that the things affirming the immutable eternal metaphysical truths expressed by the philosophy perennis in various philosophical systems emerging over changing times are true. Some things are denied there, and they are also wrong. We can actually note this as a natural result of the natural human thought process. There have been various criticisms and rejections of René Guénon's philosophy, both from within traditionalism itself and from the modern paradigm framework. However, because the criticisms from within traditionalism remain within traditionalism, I do not feel the need to address them much. Criticisms from the modern paradigm, which I consider insufficient and inconsistent, I will not address. The main, most consistent and profound refutation of René Guénon that I consider today is Haydar Jamal's theological rebuttal. Guénon, starting from the initial primordial metaphysical unity of traditions, discusses various subsequent manifestations.
That is, the later emerging traditions are manifestations that have taken different forms of the initial tradition. Haydar Kemal contrasts the monistic priesthood tradition with the monotheistic prophecy tradition.
The main characteristic of the tradition of priesthood is merging with pure being, that is, identifying with ultimate reality. This identification occurs in a qualityless absolute, that is nothing other than itself or negates anything else that could be. The highest unity of subject and object is identity. This is precisely it. Perhaps the rotating wheel of fortune is actually this absolute, which eliminates everything it encounters and accepts nothing other than itself. This is also non-duality. According to René Guénon, the first contour in Satya was the revolution of the warriors against the Brahmans, that is, the authorities. That, after this revolution, a series of catastrophes that overturned the whole order began. However, Jamal calls this revolution the revolution of those possessing heroic consciousness. According to Guénon, contour initiation is actually a leading force towards degradation. The warriors rise against the priests, then the merchants rise against the warriors. Finally, the Shudras, that is the Lumpens, the lowest class, reach the top. This is the shift of these castes, and it is the ultimate stage of profanism. It is what lies at the foundation of modern profane society. Haydar Jamal responds to this as follows. There is no such thing as profanism. In fact, what is called profanism is a mask to define the peripheral mass consciousness. According to Kamal, the sacred authority hasn't disappeared. It has just moved behind the scenes. On the contrary, hierocracy, meaning sacred authority, remains concealed behind the scenes, further strengthening its power and masking it through modern institutions, open society, parliamentary systems, and various secular modern images, while it recedes into the background. The crypto-bureaucracy has created various obstacles between its actual authority and the mass consciousness. At this point, it is relevant to read an issue noted by Haydar Jamal. The external essence of our monotheistic Abrahamism is that the infinitely qualityless absolute, the ultimate instance of perception, is actually the celestial enemy of the absolutely living God, the absolute subject. Let me note here an issue regarding the thesis called The Theology of the Death of God by Protestant theologians like Bonhoeffer and Althusser. When Nietzsche said God is dead, there was a metaphor, but the theologians mentioned above note that the Christian God truly died on the cross, not metaphorically. This leads to the emergence of atheist Christianity, secular Christianity. So the absence of God naturally results in a form of atheism for Christianity. I mention this because, particularly in the personalist worldview, the treatment of the death of God during Kali Yuga, the final period characterized by degradation and the spread of materialism, is a noteworthy issue in philosophy. It is also present in other mythologies. In contrast to the theology of the dead God in Kali Yuga, it is as if the belief in the living God as mentioned in Ayat al-Kursi, that is, the belief in the living God emerges here. As I mentioned earlier, the issue of the death of God appears in many mythologies such as Odinism and in matters like the Hindu god Shiva placing himself in the role of the dead. In this regard, I actually mentioned it as a sign of Kali Yuga because I connected and interpreted the issue of God's death, especially with this traditionalism, relating it to a kind of disintegration of the initial order and the abandonment of people in the modern world. The crisis of the modern world is actually manifesting itself against the backdrop of increasing wars. In any case, such a crisis, such a collapse does not condemn the hero to anything, nor can it. On the contrary, it opens up new opportunities to end the constantly turning and repeating cycle of fate. The size of these new opportunities, however, can occur through a turn towards the living God presented by the uniquely non-analogous Abrahamic monotheistic path. In the cultural, intellectual, political, and social discussions within the society we are in, topics expressing traditional discourse or modern paradigms sometimes come up, often without references and in a disorganized manner. The true essence of these kinds of topics and discussions remains closed off to the majority. Most people around the world, as well as in our society, find themselves on the receiving end, going with the flow. I believe this type of video slide will be useful, at least to avoid falling victim to the baseless manipulations of pseudo-intellectuals. There is such an expression in the meaning of a Quranic verse in our language. Truth has come, falsehood has vanished. Indeed, falsehood is bound to vanish.